Do you know where your children are? When I was growing up, they had a commercial, and you would see feet, and it was late at night. You knew it was late at night, feet on the pavement, and then it would say, "Do you know where your children are?" And it would tell you what time it was. And it was, oh, is that what it was on 10 o'clock? So it must have been like the curfew time or something like that. And so I remember that. And so what this one comes from is not even just knowing physically where your children are, because most of us know where our children are physically, hopefully, right? But spiritually, do you know where your children are? And the reason why this is so important is because Tom and I were youth pastors at one time, and I decided to ask this group of youth who had been, many of them had been raised. It wasn't really so much of an outreach group as it was a group that had grown up in the church mostly. And so I decided to ask them one day to close their eyes and to bow their heads. And can you please raise your hand if you're absolutely certain and reassured that if something were to happen to you today, that you know that there's a home for you in heaven, that you know that you're right with God, that you know that your salvation is secure. And if you're sure of that, I think I told them to raise their hands if they weren't sure of that. And I was shocked at how many of them raised their hands. And I am sure that most of their parents didn't even have a clue that their own children were feeling intimidated by this whole issue of, am I saved? Am I right with God? I did some bad things. So is that okay? Am I good? Do I need to go forward again? And this whole issue of salvation and what salvation truly is became a matter of their heart that they were afraid to even discuss with their parents. And from this came conversations with some of them about things that they had experienced that their parents had no idea that they had experienced. And many of them were doubting their salvation because of these experiences that their parents didn't know about. So obviously, we had to do some pastoring and leading and helping them to connect with their parents. And so we really kind of, it was like we dug up some muddy waters that I really hadn't counted on, but I was so thankful for the opportunity to do that. We stir some things up. And sometimes in the process, you can get overwhelmed. I didn't know this was going to happen, Lord. I didn't know that this was really what was going on in many of these children's lives. So I just want to say that for us as parents, I think this issue needs to be settled in our own hearts. So I'm not going to assume that everybody that's watching, that everybody that's here today understands what salvation is or understands how to be rightly aligned with truth in this area. So I just want to say, if any of you have questions about that, or if any of you want to talk to somebody further, we're available, and we want to continue an ongoing relationship with anybody that's interested after this class, and not just throw a bunch of information at you, but we want to walk alongside of you. And so I will tell you, I couldn't do this parenting thing without my relationship with the Lord. I absolutely could not do it. And as we said in the first introduction, that the Bible is the only real manual, parenting manual, doesn't mean you can't read books. But I'm telling you, without understanding the principles that God lays out in Scripture, I would be completely lost. And then if we give you principles, but you have things that are going on in your life that are not right with God, it's very difficult to follow through with godly principles if there's things in your own life that you're struggling with. And so I just want to say that we're not just here to say, oh, we just want to see great parenting come out of this. We want to see you connected and rightly joined to the Savior, because that's the most important thing that we can discuss today. I have my own authority with my children, and believe me, it's very limited. And as they get older and older, it's more and more limited, the authority that you have with your children. But there's an endless, eternal authority in the living God that goes way beyond what we can do as parents. And that's the authority that I have confidence in. It was the authority that the centurion had confidence in when he went to the master and said, you know, my servant is homesick. And he began to say to Yeshua, you don't have to come to my home. You can just say the word, because when you tell people to go, they go. When you tell people to come, they come. And do you remember what the Master said? I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. And so my faith and my confidence with 500 teenagers who were very broken coming into my home this was not where it all lied, in myself, in my own authority. I had to know that God's authority was backing me up, and we all need to know that. And so it's kind of half a barrel if you don't have the Savior on your side. You're operating with half a barrel. You're not fully equipped if you don't have Him working through you. And so I just want to say, again, no condemnation, but I would love for you, if you're struggling in that area, that we would make ourselves available. I also want to say that we have other books here that we use for those who have not been parented correctly. And our job here is not to condemn our parents or the way we were raised. Our job here is to look at what the Lord has told us about parenting and then to model that to our children. But if you're stuck in areas, you're like, I know I need to do that, but I can't do that. I'm having a hard time doing that. We have some resources. Some of them are free right off of our website. We have grief, which goes through some different issues of grief that parents might have that they're stuck in, and because of it, they're having a hard time parenting in certain areas, connecting with their children. And again, we're not just throwing information at you. We're willing to walk you through it. The Deception of a People is a really good curriculum that Tom and I did together. We took a couple of years to do this, questioning, what do you believe and why do you believe it? And so this is another one. And then Freedom's Journey. And this is those who might be struggling with addictive behaviors or behavioral patterns that they're not breaking. And again, this is all things that we can work through with you. We have mentors. We have a team of women. We have a team of men that can help you through this. And so we want to go beyond today and say, we're here. We're here to help you. Do you know where your children are? The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself, that's your next fill-in, brings shame to his mother. Boy, do people have a problem with that one. Proverbs 29:15. I don't have time to get into it, but in Proverbs 31, who's praised by the children? So this concept, this Hebrew concept, is not foreign and was not foreign to them, that the mother would get shame, because it was all about, Tom said, there's like a pattern that God has established with families and with the children who are supposed to be honoring the mom, who's supposed to be honoring the hubby, who's supposed to be honoring the leaders of their churches and their communities. And then our communities are supposed to be honoring, God honoring our Lord. And so it all goes in a beautiful direction where ultimately, so for them to say that it brought shame to the mother, that wasn't unusual for them to hear that. For us, it might seem a little unfair, but in their culture, that was not unusual. And so it's kind of like if in the corporate world, if something goes wrong at one level, what are they going to be trying to narrow in on? Okay, who's directly responsible? Now, the whole corporation can suffer, right? But who's directly responsible for what happened? And so we want to make sure that we are following God's pattern. And in a patriarchal society, which we struggle with, I don't struggle with it, because the whole concept of Messiah has that in mind. It's not male dominance at all. It's male loving, male protecting, male preparing. It's all about the patriarchal society that the Lord designed was for that man, for that firstborn who got the double inheritance that we think, that's unfair, that's not right. Well, they were the ones that helped the marginalized. They were the ones that got people out of debt. They were the ones that took the family inheritance and make sure it was distributed to those that were struggling. So when we look at what people perceive as they look at believers as male dominance, it was the male taking the role to care for, just like we see as described in Ephesians when it says that Yeshua laid his life down. Jesus laid his life down. And just as he did for the bride of Christ, the male is supposed to do for his bride, his wife. He washes her with the word. He lays his life down. So understand that whole concept of this patriarchal idea and thought was really designed as our Messiah Yeshua comes on the scene and says, I'm here to care for you. I'm here to lay my life down for you. I'm here to provide for you and to protect you. So we have to be very cautious when we talk about genders and different things like that. He set up a beautiful system, and I don't think I want to mess with it. How about you? So, and then what I want to talk about here is this is kind of a little bit off the beaten path, but I love birds, so I love studying about birds. And so in the avian world, we have a cowbird as an example of a negligent parent. And how many of you know what the cowbird does? You know, Jason? Okay. How do you know?
Is that the one that lays the egg in the other's nest and like
And hopes that that other bird will accept it and care for it. And so you're filling here. The cowbird is an example of negligent parenting from the avian world. The cowbird succeeds in shirking its responsibilities and in the process fails its young, while the negligent parent abandons its egg to enjoy a carefree life with others of its kind. The embryonic life of the one she was serving was destroyed. So it's really, and I want to say here, it's not just abuse that can kill a child, but neglect comes in the back door sometimes. And in this bird, in this cowbird example, the neglect is what could, because many of the birds would not accept the egg that looks differently. Some of them would, some of them wouldn't. And so that other one might just kick it right out of its nest and say, this is not my egg, I'm not going to do this. So neglect, not just abuse. Our society has become good at shirking its responsibilities. Crime among young children is on the rise. That's your next fill-in. I don't think that's any surprise. And we have criminogenic behavior, which people are talking about now, of a system, situation, or place causing or likely to cause criminal behavior. And listen to just some of the things that they say can cause this, can kind of alert you. Struggle with authority figures, a sense of entitlement, no acceptance of responsibility, involvement in pleasure-seeking activities. So I can remember hearing a few of those, and there's a much longer list that they have. But I can remember hearing that and thinking about a couple of them, like, one of my grandsons is like this. And you kind of start, your mind can race in all different directions, right? So the bad news is that we're all born criminals. We're all born criminals. We've been born into this world in sin. And so we're all criminals. So that's the bad news. The good news is that he came to set the prisoners free. And so as you see the vulnerable ones in your midst, you might see children that they display a little bit more of that than I want to see. See, that's where we become the good evaluators and the good investors. Good evaluators and good investors. And we begin investing in those areas where we might see that there are vulnerabilities in those children's lives. Don't drop off your responsibility when you drop off your child. I don't care where you're dropping them off. I don't care if it's at church. I don't care if it's in the classroom in the nursery. Don't drop your responsibility off. Always pray with them and stay informed. One thing that I think is really helpful is transferring responsibility. When you go to the nursery, transfer the responsibility to the people that are in charge that you know and you feel confident that they will not abuse the authority of your children, and just say, okay, mom's going to be in service, and so Miss Julie is in charge today, so I want to make sure that you respect her and honor her. Okay, so just pray with them, transfer authority, stay informed. Whatever it is, if they're in public school, you want to know what curriculum they're using. You want to make sure that you're exploring that. You might have them opt out of some things if you're not comfortable. And believe me, I've seen issues in every arena. Serious issues in every arena, whether it's homeschooling, private schooling, or public schooling. Is your discipline consistent? This is another thing that could keep our children from seeing the right model in us. Sometimes in public, we're different than we are in private. We may take it up a few notches when we're home, and then we take it down a few notches when we're in front of people. And so children see that, and they see that as hypocrisy, and they'll see that mom and dad are putting a mask on here. And sometimes they will test it. And they'll keep testing it. So, and then also sometimes we've had a busy day versus a normal day. What do you like on a busy day? Are you just ignoring everything and they know that? And so what always happens as soon as you get on the phone? What happens? They have all kinds of needs and things going on. Younger children really are good at this. And of course, with Tom and I, they love to. They would ask Tom if they wanted a treat. Always. So it would always be they went to Dad first, and sometimes he'd send them back to me, and then I'd send them back to him. We had to kind of get it straight because it'd be like trying to honor each other's authority. Oh, go ask your dad, and then he'd be like, "Go ask your mom." So. So is your discipline consistent? Young children have a lower nature that constantly needs to be tempered until that child has matured in Christ. They will usually, when given opportunity, make a choice that can bring danger or harm. Now, I don't mean to make this about discipline right now because we're going to have a whole section on discipline, but what this is really about is modeling for your children certain things that are going to help them to know who you really are so that you can know who they really are. If you're hiding who you really are and they see you doing that, it's going to be really easy for them to step in the same role. And then before you know it, you don't know who your children are because they're not sure who you are. I see something different in mom and dad, public versus private. Leaving a child to himself can trick him into believing that there are times when we will not face consequences for our sinful behavior. And so it's really important that if we do see something, they can think, okay, well, I've done this 100 times. I've stuck my finger in the light socket, and nothing's really happened. And then one day they have their finger in their mouth or their thumb in their mouth, and they do it, and they get a little bit of a different reaction. So that's why, if you have something that you're teaching your children or modeling to your children, that you need to follow through with that because then it tricks them into thinking, oh, it's okay, I'm not really going to face consequences. Eli is a biblical example of a father that did not watch over his sons. The priests had a certain amount that was assigned to them, a certain portion for them, and the sons were wanting what was over and above. They were wanting these fatty portions over and above, and that was considered treating the things of God with contempt instead of honoring the things of God. And so that's what these sons of Eli, who were supposed to be priests, that's what they were doing. What's wrong with that picture there? He allowed them to continue, but how did he find out about what was happening? The people had to tell them. So he didn't know. When we're talking about, do you know where your children are? He might have known where they were locationally, but he didn't know where they were spiritually. They were sleeping with women. They were taking the portions that did not belong to them. So they were in a place where they were abusing the things of God. That's the idea. Very good. They didn't have the fear of God. And know that this was going on. This was a prolonged thing. It wasn't just something that happened. So this was an ongoing struggle with these men abusing. And so uh, he's warned by other people about what's going on. You might want to read the whole story. Just take a look at that yourself to get an idea, a real understanding of what's happening. But one of the things that happened is the results. Well, let me go ahead and go up to the fill in there. Failing to discipline or disciplining with wrong motives or in harsh and unreasonable ways. So that's extreme, right? Either not disciplining at all, so neglect, versus disciplining with wrong motives or harsh and unreasonable ways, which we're going to cover in the discipline section. It distorts the image of God to our children. And the results of Eli's unfaithfulness in parenting was death for his sons, death for himself, death for his daughter-in-law. It just went on and on and on as you read that story. It's so tragic. So tragedy for him did not begin with abuse. It began with neglect and not spiritually watching over his sons. That's how it began. And in verse 29 of, you see two more passages there that you can read. To honor time here for all of you, we're not going to go there, but you take the time to read it. In 1 Samuel 2, verse 29 particular says, "You honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts." So this is tragic, and I don't want to end on tragedy this time, but I do want to make sure that we have a very sober attitude about understanding why spiritually we need to train our children, why we need to watch over our children, why we need to know where they are, not just locationally and physically, but spiritually and emotionally, why we need to be good shepherds that understand the needs of our children and are aware of how to meet those needs and how to go to our shepherd, our chief shepherd. I'm so thankful that we have a chief shepherd. But one of the things that it said was that Eli was very heavy. How do you think Eli got heavy? Taking those fatty portions, taking the extra portions. And it's very possible that because he benefited from his son's sinful actions, he looked the other way. And so we have to think about how that can affect our children tragically when we're willing to look the other way and not really look at what we need to be able to bring light to a situation where there's darkness. The wages of sin is death. That's your next fill-in. And that's just a given. That's a spiritual principle. And that we need to understand that principle and hopefully become more alert about where our children are in every aspect of their lives. And then trusting that areas that they're not allowing you in, that God's authority can go. And that's what's so important about trusting His authority, is that His authority can take over when yours is being rejected. And always know that and always understand that. Proverbs, you guys go ahead and turn to that. in your own time, if you don't mind, I just captured the last part of it. Children will die for lack of discipline. That's your next fill in. The next class that we're going to be going into is specifically about discipline. So do you know where your children are? That's the question for you today, is do you know where your children are? And rather than leaving on a negative note, I want to kind of continue along with the thought of watching, spiritually watching. So when we read about the ancient city of Israel and the cities that were there at the time of those readings, there were thick walls around these cities, and those walls were intended to keep the people safe, keep enemies from approaching, and keep the people inside safe. And so they had what they called watchmen that would be on the walls of that city, and they would have a view that the people down did not have, much like what you would see as a prison guard. When you go to a prison, you see that tower, and there's men watching from the tower. They can see things that people on the ground cannot see. And so their vision is much clearer. And if an enemy's approaching, they can see what's approaching. As a good shepherd, you need to be faithful watchmen. Some of you have already sensed certain temptations that your children are vulnerable to. You've already sensed that. You already know. You're one step ahead of them because you're faithful watchmen. You're praying. You're seeking the Lord. You're asking Him for wisdom and insight. Some of you can already see certain tendencies in the smallest of children, as I can see with some of my grandchildren. You see tendencies, don't you? And so you want to be faithful watchmen. But rather than being negative about this, rather than saying, oh my goodness, I see disaster, because just to be honest, most of the time the females go way beyond and look at the disaster and the very worst case scenario that can possibly happen. And this is where it's so wonderful to be balanced. If you're a single mom, be balanced by some good shepherds around you. But the most wonderful thing is that those watchmen didn't just see negative things. They didn't just see envoys of enemies approaching. They could see good things approaching. Remember when the Queen of Sheba came with all kinds of spices and wonderful things and all kinds of good things? And so those watchmen would be like, hey, something's coming. There's some good stuff coming. Open the gates. There's some good stuff coming. And so as spiritual watchmen over your children, don't just look at the vulnerabilities of your children, but look at their potential and look at their value and begin to watch for the good things that the Lord has prepared for them. And as you're on that watchtower, we don't want to be like the blind, sleepy, dumb watchmen of Israel. If you look at Isaiah 56, 10 through 12, do that in your time. They could not, it says they were like dogs that couldn't bark. They were falling asleep. They weren't discerning. They weren't watching over what they should have been watching over. And so they weren't good shepherds. But as we look at what job that the Lord has given us, and as we get vision that we can only get with the authority of the Master, we can only get it watching and praying. We can only get it when we're rightly aligned with Him. That's when we get vision that we wouldn't have here on the ground. And that's, we can look at the vulnerable things and we can look at the beautiful things that God has prepared for our children. So let's be good watchmen. The Hebrew word is tsafah, and it means behold, look, spy, observe closely, lean forward, and wait for. It's not in your book. So let's start being good finders, looking at the potential, looking at the value, waiting for those good things to come, and knowing when to open the gates. Okay, so before we move on, we ended at do you know where your children are? And hopefully all of you were able to do some homework together, and then we'll do a little discussion at the tables. But before I jump into the next teaching, which is more about discipline, there was a few things that I wanted to add to do you know where your children are? No more fill-ins, but I wanted to share some personal experiences. As we said, it's not just do you know where your children are? Well, they're in the playroom, they're in their crib, they're out with their friends. Locationally, we're not talking about that. We're talking about do you know where your children are spiritually, emotionally? Are you in tune with your children? And so, what's influencing them? What types of influences do you have over your children's lives? And what is the character of the people that are speaking into their lives? And are you faithful watchmen? We left with that thought that we are to be faithful watchmen as parents. And that might sound complicated, but it's really bringing your children before the Lord, interceding, even fasting and praying. If there's something that you're just not hearing from God and you feel like there's a stronghold, fast and pray. And that's a type of watching as well. And so really getting that view that you won't get on the ground. Remember, we said that in the cities of old, the ancient cities, they had watchtowers, and they would have an eye for what the people on the ground could not see. And I believe God wants to give that eye to every one of you as parents, for your children and for your grandchildren. I had the privilege, I don't think it was a coincidence, I had spoken with you about a youth group that Tom and I were leading years ago, and many of them did not know or understand eternal security, and many of their parents would have thought, well, my children are saved. And so as we brought up this issue, and it opened up a can of worms, but it was good. And I just happened to meet one of the ladies that we were pastoring who had gone through a difficult situation when she was babysitting. And she was exposed to something by the people that she was babysitting. And after we shared about how many of you are sure of your salvation, she was one of the ones that came to us later and explained to us about having had an experience with her babysitting, that her parents didn't know about it. And because of it, she felt unclean. And because of it, she doubted her salvation. And so it was a secret that was making her sick. And we were able to redirect her to her parents and encourage her. And the Lord has resolved that. She's a beautiful woman. It was so lovely to see her with her son there and to see her doing so well. And I wonder what would have happened if she had kept that secret. What would have happened if nobody really stepped into her world to be able to expose the enemy's lies and be able to ground her in the truth. And so I'm so grateful that I did get to see her after sharing with you. Is there a secret in your children's lives? I know that as we have dealt with teenager after teenager, and even adult after adult, many of them who have struggled with addictive behaviors, many of them have carried secrets. Many of them are carrying strongholds because of those secrets. So if we can be aware of that and step into our children's worlds and encourage them, I think it's important. And we talked about how we have a measure of authority in our children's lives, but it's limited. And as we bring the authority of heaven into our home, and one of the ways we do that is by spiritually watching over them, calling on the Lord, teaching our children that He's the center of our universe. He's the center of our day, the center of our everything. As we do that, I believe that our children will have an understanding that our authority may not be enough, but God's authority is. And so when we as parents, maybe we're not always terribly safe, we might be fearful or explosive, we might be too fragile, but if they understand and they're confident that we're under shepherds who's being led by the chief shepherd, they might feel a little safer with us knowing that we have somebody that's going to watch our back as they share their baggage or things that are heavy in their heart with us. And so that's where I think it's important. So I cannot overemphasize this aspect of spiritually watching. Tom and I have developed a practice of praying every morning over all the children that were in our home, whether it be the teens that God brought or our own children, family members. And we would do that every morning. Of course, as you continue to make the list longer, you're praying a little bit longer, and you wake up a little bit earlier, and whatever it takes to spiritually watch and bring them before the Lord. And I want to tell you two incidences that happen, and these are absolutely supernatural. And that's why I say our authority can have a measure of influence, but God's authority is supernatural. And I want to share this because I want to encourage you with these two stories. As we were praying for all of our daughters that were in the home, I know this sounds a little interesting, but as we were praying, I saw a vision of a document, and somebody was signing the document. And I just knew instantly that something was going on in the back bedrooms where my foster teenagers were. And so I went back there, knocked on the door of one of them, and I opened the door, and two of them were there, and they looked at me. Their eyes were as big as saucers, and I said, "What are you doing?" And there was a document. It was a state document. When they were in our home, we asked them not to be on food stamps because we wanted them to see the Lord as our provider, as our supplier. Some of them would go on food stamps behind our back and trade them for things they shouldn't be trading them for. And so one of them was forging my signature as the head of the household. And she was doing that. And while we were praying, the Lord showed us this. It was such a beautiful example to be able to tell them, I'm limited in my ability to love you and care for you, but He's not. He showed me this was going on in this room this morning while we were praying. They were both astounded. It was such a beautiful, it really turned out beautiful in the end, and as the light comes into the dark places, we have that opportunity to then gently guide them and direct them back. Another incident that happened was after Tom and I were done praying, I'm in the shower, and I feel in my heart that I need to leave the home and go look for one of our sheep. She was supposed to be working, and so she had left the home to check out for her job, and she was on foot, so she was walking to a fast food job. And so I'm telling you, I put my hair up in a towel. I hadn't even finished washing it. Put my hair up in a towel, got in that car, told Tom, I know that I have to go find her. And I kid you not. Her mother had left her with us and told us she is not allowed to see the boyfriend because of some things that had happened in an exchange between them. And so he lived in Sierra Vista, so he was supposedly hours away. So when I pulled into a parking lot where her fast food job was, she was sitting on just a cement wall. And I pulled up, and as I pulled up and I saw her, right on the other side of me was her boyfriend getting out of the car, and I pulled in right between the two of them. And once again, the saucer eyes. How did you know? And so these are beautiful things. I mean, these are things that help us to be able to guide and direct. Those supernatural things did not happen all the time, but let me tell you, they happened frequently enough to cause these girls to know that there was an unseen authority in our home. And I tell you, it kept them in check during times when they probably would have pulled a few things over on me, for sure. Maybe not Tom, but for sure me. But I want to tell you, I want to end this segment about spiritually watching by sharing with you a beautiful story about my third-born child. And she was getting ready. She had graduated from high school, and she was getting ready to serve in a ministry in Picacho that ministered in a camp setting to underprivileged children from the inner city. And so we were getting her prepared for that, and she was going to be taking off shortly. And I had a sense in my heart that her husband, whoever he was, who I didn't know about, was watching her. And it kind of sounded a little creepy at first, a little stalking at first. But I felt like that's what the Lord put in my heart. And it wasn't long after that the owner of the coffee shop where she had been working, a very precious gentleman, contacted Tom and I and sat down with us and said, I've been watching your daughter. I've been seeing how she works and how she shows up early and how she works really hard. And I just want you to know that I'm really interested. She's a 10-cow wife to me. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with that saying with trading, but what he was saying was she's a number 10. She's awesome. and he asked for permission to court her with the intention of marriage. And I mean, he laid everything out on the table. Do you want to look at my bank accounts and my family history? It's not good. It's not. I said, don't worry, it's okay. And just put everything out on the table and said, would you please watch us and tell us, you know, we're asking for your blessing. And so that was a beautiful picture of spiritually watching and seeing something good. And then having that confirmation that when he came to us, I had already had that dropped in my heart. And so it was even though we didn't, you know, it took them a little while. I mean, just to kind of work things out. But so it wasn't like, let's get married tomorrow. It was a time frame, a period of time, getting to know each other, getting to know our family. And so I just wanted to tell you there's awesome things that you can see when you're spiritually watching. So I don't want any of you to walk in fear about this because it's a beautiful thing. When whatever the Holy Spirit shows you is a beautiful thing, right? Because if he's showing you a problem, it's because he wants you to have a solution. And remember, he's the counselor. And so we don't have to fear this spiritual watching. Some of us are like, I don't know if I want to know what's going to happen. No, you do want to know because God is going to equip you thoroughly for whatever the task is. So I want to ask all of you just to be waiting for the beautiful things. And if you see the ugly, trust that rescue is on the way, okay? Always trust. All right, so if you did your homework, you defined your parenting styles. There was nothing complicated about that. You could just say what you thought it was or even, you know, look it up in a dictionary. So if any of you did that, great. But what I want to do is go to page, 17 in my book, which is Appendix B. And before we go to the table breakdown, table discussion. It's 33 in your booklets. If you have a small handbook, it's 33. And let's finish this up. You're going to discuss the parenting styles, but parenting gives us the marvelous opportunity to examine our own lives. I don't know about you, but I learned so much in parenting myself. And if you go about it that way, I can guarantee you, you're going to have a lot more patience and grace in your parenting when you go at it from the standpoint of what you can learn. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And I hope that you had a chance to discuss it, especially husband and wife. What values do I want to communicate and demonstrate to my child? So your fill-in there is parenting gives us the marvelous opportunity to examine our own lives. So that will bring us to the conclusion of where are your children, or do you know where your children are? And then I would like you to have time. Now, if you brought your parenting quiz and you want to share it, that's fine. But here are some questions that we can ask or discuss. What specific styles listed do you relate to in your own parenting? How might your parenting style relate to your view of your Heavenly Father? So I would like you to take some time to discuss that in your groups. I want to just say, please just give a few minutes so that everyone at your table gets a chance to discuss. But you can even discuss your findings if you want in your parenting quiz, if you want to do that and say, hey, I found out that I am this parenting style. And again, that quiz just gave you, it was very simple, just three styles. I don't want you to feel pigeonholed. I don't want you to feel like you're locked into this whatever the style is. I want to use this as a means of discussing, looking at ourselves, examining ourselves. So if you can have a few minutes at your tables, we're going to do 15 minutes on this. It's wonderful to be in community because others can help balance us. And so, did you find, any of you find that your parenting styles, maybe between husband and wife, were opposite? Did anybody find that at all? Okay. And so, what we want to be very cautious of is that era breeds era. So, many times you'll have a harsh parent and then a permissive parent. Both of those are era. And so, sometimes if you have a harsh parent, you want to balance it with permissiveness, and that doesn't balance. It's just going to, you have to get together and complement each other instead of competing with whose parenting style is right. And you might need to get someone else in there to help you. So I just want to mention that. And Chris and Carmen from Fortified Marriages Ministries are here. They have wonderful resources. Yes, thank you for coming. We appreciate you very much. And they have a beautiful workbook that discusses differences and trying to work out those differences. And it has a wonderful surveys in it. It's a beautiful book, 52 lessons. And so go visit their table if you'd like to know more about that. I just wanted to share a few things. And what you'll see from one generation to the next is you'll see that extreme going. So if I felt like my emotional needs weren't met and I was more children seen, not heard, see, I would have the tendency of going to the extreme and have a child-centered home where the emotions of the child are the most important thing. And that can be very off balance as well. And we have what's called, there's a man named Ted Cunningham. Chris and Carmen gave me some of their materials to listen to. Very interesting. He talks about vanity parenting. And in this generation, this culture, we need to see that. It's defined as using the attributes of your children and their performance to embellish your own. And so many times privilege with no responsibility can lead to delayed adolescence. So if it's a child-centered home and the child is struggling and you don't want them to struggle and you don't let them struggle, you're going to see a delayed adolescence, the inability to get out there and make life work because they're avoiding all struggles because you've helped them to avoid all struggles. And so I just want to say that the negative root system of both of these faulty extremes is a denial of Adonai's plans for parents to pass on honor to their children. It's upside down parenting. And let me explain very quickly before we move on, because I think this is important. From the very beginning, God blessed mankind. It was the first beautiful act of blessing, created them and blessed them and commissioned them. They didn't do anything to deserve the blessing. The blessing was there because he saw value in what he created. That's a parent passing honor on to their child through the blessing, through recognizing their value. What we have seen is parents, the flip side of that is parents wanting their children to bring honor to them. Do you see how faulty that is? And how difficult it can be to parent a child when you're depending on them to bring you honor? That's not how God intended it. And so then shame enters into the picture, fear-based parenting, you hide things. Your family looks good on the outside, but there's lots of things going on the inside that you don't want anybody to know about. So please understand, we are supposed to pass the honor on. And where do we get our honor from? He has given it to us. We are valuable because of what he's passed on to us through the blood of Yeshua. He placed the highest value on us. And so we get to place honor on our children because of that. And so we don't have to do the fear-based parenting.